Good afternoon. I appreciate the invitation to join your conversation about life-wide learning today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to visit with you, but I hope you've had a good exchange so far and hope to add some ideas to your conversation. Your conference theme of encouraging, supporting, and recognizing life-wide learning is really crucial because of the connection between personal development and learning. Learning is often misconstrued as being a cognitive function about knowledge acquisition and thus limited to the classroom. But you as life-wide educators know, and we also know from extensive research on human development and learning, that who we are and how we relate to other people has a big impact on how we come to know. The constructive developmental tradition in the human development research outlines three specific and interconnected dimensions of development that have a big impact on how we make meaning. And one of those, of course, is the cognitive. And it has to do with the nature of knowledge, the limits of knowledge, the assumptions we hold about those things, and subsequently how we come to know. But this tradition also outlines assumptions about how we think about ourselves, or the intrapersonal dimension, and how we think about our social relations with other people, or the interpersonal dimension. And all three of these are intertwined in a holistic perspective that I think matches well with life-wide learning. And we use these assumptions to make sense of our experiences. And when we have experiences that call these assumptions into question, we're prompted to reevaluate and perhaps reconstruct those assumptions. When we reconstruct them, we refer to that as development. Robert Kegan talks about this as the growth of the mind. And he talks about this process of standing apart from our assumptions and reevaluating them, or as he says, liberating ourselves from that in which we've been embedded to have it rather than be had by it, is how he describes the growth of the mind. This idea is very similar to what Jack Mezirow calls transformational learning, or how we learn to negotiate and act on our own purposes, values, feelings, meanings, rather than those that we have uncritically assimilated from others. So this connection between human development and learning, I think, is crucial to understand if we hope to engage learners in transformational learning. Now, Jack Mezirow also talks about learning as having two components. Informational learning, which is how I think we typically think about learning, is a very important component, and it has to do with acquiring the relevant knowledge, skills, expanding our frames of reference. These are all crucial parts of learning. But we could say that they are perhaps necessary but insufficient to work with complexity in today's society, because we're often called upon to adapt when things don't go as we expect. For example, if we're going to have surgery, we want our surgeon to have the best knowledge about whatever procedure it is that we are about to have. We want her to have great skills to pull that off, but we also want her to be adaptive if something unexpected happens, to be able to navigate that complexity, and that requires transformational learning, or shifting how we think about what we're doing. So transformational learning involves these capacities, these cognitive, intra, and interpersonal capacities, and growing those over time. If we're going to engage people in transformational learning, and I think that's what life-wide education is attempting to do, then we need to think about the fact that many learners have been socialized in informational learning because that has taken the foreground typically in educational settings. And so learners who've been socialized to focus on information sometimes find it hard to focus on their underlying assumptions about how they come to know. So even those of us who are committed to engaging in transformational learning need to figure out how to connect that to learners' current assumptions. So to illustrate this deep connection between personal learning and development, I'd like to share a story with you from my longitudinal study of young adults' learning and development. I've been following a group of young people since the time they entered college at the age of 18 to their present lives when they are in their mid-40s. And this has given me a wonderful opportunity to see a variety of ways in which the assumptions about knowledge, about self, about relationships might evolve from uncritically following what we accept from other people to developing internal criteria to guide our lives. And the development of these internal criteria is what we call self-authorship. And there are many developmental theorists and leadership scholars who are writing now that the capacity for self-authorship is what is minimally crucial for navigating the complexity of the demands of adult life in the 21st century. So I've chosen to share a story from a person whom I'll call Kurt, because Kurt was highly involved in college in what we in the States would call co-curricular activities and what you would probably call life-wide activities. Yet, as you'll hear when we get into his story, his journey towards self-authorship really didn't start until after his college career. The point I want to come back to after the story is that I think we could and should engage people in reevaluating their assumptions and developing self-authorship earlier. And I think we could do that in higher education. So let me tell you a little bit about Kurt. As a young man, Kurt loved interacting with people. He loved serving people. He spent his summers as a Little League baseball coach and a camp counselor. When he went to college, he threw himself full force into both academics and what we'd call co-curricular, or what you might call life-wide activities. And so he was very invested in getting as much as he could out of his college experience. His first year, he joined a fraternity. He also joined a student foundation that raises money for the university. By his sophomore year, he had a leadership position in both of those organizations. And asked about what that meant to him, he said, "I'm looking 2.5 years from now and what will happen and how I'll be perceived. I'm trying to polish myself for the next step in my career." He also noted that he got more involved in these activities every day. One example was typing a friend's paper because the friend was in a bind, even though Kurt sacrificed his own work to do that. And this would foreshadow something that Kurt dealt with through most of his 20s, and that is sacrificing his needs for the needs of other people. By his junior year, Kurt was in charge of a major university event where he supervised 35 students for 13 months to pull off this event. And reflecting on it, he said, "The time commitment that I put in, it's not just a resume filler. I think I get a lot out of it. I think I round myself out a little bit more as far as being able to find outlets. I feel very productive when I'm doing these types of things. I feel very valuable. I feel very directed when I'm doing these things." Here you can hear that Kurt's reflection is about feeling valuable and productive about his involvement, rather than learning about himself and learning about his value of serving others. So despite the range of co-curricular activities and leadership positions that Kurt engaged in, he never talked about any learning partners who encouraged him to reflect on what he was learning and how these related to his relationships with other people. His focus, both in his communications major and in his co-curricular involvement, was on being positively perceived for admission to law school, which was his career goal. He spent his college career faithfully doing his academic work, engaging in leadership positions, assuming it would all add up to a meaningful life as an attorney. When Kurt graduated from college, he took a position as a legal assistant. He described what happened. "I was motivated by wanting to go to law school. The law firm was also motivated by prestige. Being a lawyer would be good because I would get acceptance. But then I got a taste of the environment, and it was not one I wanted to be in. I was torn about it. I talked to my dad. I'll remember that conversation the rest of my life. Dad said he didn't like wet weather, and he might move upon retirement. And I thought, what? I'm staying here to be near family, and you're moving? And I thought, I'm staying here to be near family because I'm not living life for myself." And he realized he needed to start doing that. The impact of this conversation was immense. Kurt realized that he made choices to please others around him. And he said, a lot of times when pleasing others, there's a conflict along the way. Trying to please two parties who had opposing wants, my girlfriend and my family, I tried to choose the person who would be least mad. This recognition that he needed to start living life for himself was simultaneously a recognition of the drawbacks of uncritical acceptance on external others' perceptions. This moved Kurt from uncritically following external formulas to a crossroads fraught with tension between constructing his internal voice and listening to the voice of others. As Kurt soon learned, awareness is valuable, but it doesn't mean an immediate change in long-held assumptions. He reported that he learned more about his reliance on others for his self-worth by going to some workshops in his early 20s. And here's what he learned. He said, "The power of choice is mine. I have a choice of how I want to perceive each and every situation in my life. Obviously, I'm not to that point yet because I choose to make myself happy or make myself sad on what other people are thinking. But I think I'd like to someday get to a point where I can say, okay, that's your perception. I'm not dependent on you for my happiness or my sadness." And I think that would be a very strong, very spiritual place to be. Here, Kurt clearly articulates the idea that it's important for him to construct an internal voice to guide his meaning making. Yet he is just as clear about the fact that he's yet to do that, and he really doesn't know how to go about that. A few years later, in one of our conversations, Kurt explicitly commented on the difference between talking about ideas and living ideas. By this time, he'd worked at a hardware store, a youth center, and a factory, and he was still exploring who he wanted to be and what he wanted to do. And he offered this comment on the process of trying to listen to and cultivate his internal voice. He said, "My philosophy, what I'm looking for out of life, is the same. The ability to influence the world around me in a positive way. What has changed is that it's further unfolded in my life. 2 years ago, I was talking about it. Now, I'm living it. That's a totally huge difference. I probably thought I was living it then. What is inside impacts what is outside, but it comes from the inside. The inside is not influenced by others. You have to learn that it does come from the inside. For a while, you think others can make decisions. You learn in the end that it comes down to you." There's a poem, something like Man in the Glass. It talks about going through life, but the only person you answer to is the man in the glass, the mirror looking at yourself. I can't remember the exact lines, but one is that the most important person in the glass is you. My parents have instilled that a lot. They never gave answers. They just said, "You get out on your own and we'll support you." My experience with the law firm set me on the road to where I am now. I thought it would bring me happiness. I tried to live society's plan for me. No way. Then it was like, okay, I don't think there's any self-actualization in what society has planned. In order to self-actualize yourself, you have to look inside yourself. So despite his parents' encouragement to listen to himself, other societal pressures apparently were stronger in leading Kurt to try to live society's plan. Discovering that it didn't work, Kurt spent the entire decade of his 20s struggling to construct and trust his internal voice. Revealing the difficulty of that task, he shared, "One thing I recognize is that I have a tendency to overcommit myself to things. I go around committing to everyone who needs something and then see what is left for Kurt. Sometimes there's something left, sometimes not. I have to start cutting out some before I can give to Kurt. For me, balance is not a conscious thing. It just happens when I'm following what feels right and what doesn't. If I go out and try to get balance, you can bet I won't get it. The act of consciously trying to do it eliminates the possibility of achieving it. I don't know why that is. For me, if I want balance, I have to be balanced. If I want peace, I have to be at peace. If I go out and look for it, it's elusive. It's outside. I have stopped looking for it outside myself." One of the key factors for Kurt and for many others in moving out of this crossroads into self-authorship is a recognition that reality was beyond their control, but they could control their reactions to it. Kurt noted that he'd been aware of this idea for some time, but that he had only recently begun to live it. He said, "I was aware of it as early as college. I could talk about it even before college, but it never meant anything until 4 months or so ago. It was in my head. Now it's in my heart. I never had to make choices like I have to make now. As is clear from his comment, the choices that he's now faced with make this meaningful. Navigating the complexity of adult life demands that he now live this concept. He explained further how he was trying to do this. He said, "It's not that you get to control the circumstances of events happening to you. I've tried to stop that and instead control how I think about it. I had hoped I would have a family by age 31, but I'm not dwelling on it. I couldn't work the hours I work right now if I had that, and it's nice to have the flexibility to do that. I try to control events less and control my perceptions of them more. What other people think is still a motivating thing for me. There are times when I'm extremely confident, and then what people think doesn't matter. It's a matter of my conviction. At that time, I'm going to do it. It is going to happen. In the mode I'm in right now, I'm concerned about what other people think, but not to gain approval for myself. It's more where I am in a whole learning process. I have a great relationship with my boss. A lot of times, I'll ask him how he'd play something. I want to know what he thinks. But it's not who I am. I'm not basing my identity off it. It's not for gaining self-worth, just for getting resources. What makes our relationship solid is that we have an understanding. He'll come to me for the same thing. We ask what each other thinks. It's a positive, mutual understanding. We aren't looking for each other's approval. My boss is not concerned about what other people think. He doesn't define his worth on that. I take a lot of that from him. He's a positive role model. Here you can hear that Kurt's relying more on his internal voice, but he's still acknowledging that what other people think does matter. He's seeking external perspectives to gain a greater understanding, rather than to support his self-worth, which is what he's done prior to this point. In self-authorship, the internal voice coordinates external influence rather than being controlled by it. So Kurt's boss modeled this for him, and therefore he was a good partner in a mutual exchange with Kurt. Throughout his 30s, Kurt moved into management positions in the factory. His internal voice was severely tested as he found himself navigating conflicts between management and labor. But despite these difficulties, he survived and he thrived because he had an internal voice upon which to base those decisions. This internal voice also played a crucial role in his relationship outside of work. Describing his decision to marry, he said, "From the time we started dating, there weren't any questions. We went into the relationship with a totally different set of goals and objectives than in earlier relationships. To the extent that we could, more than any relationship I've ever had, we entered into it as complete people. We weren't lacking for anything, weren't needing affirmation, or needing each other to give us something to complete us. From a perspective of infatuation, I never had that with her. I've had it with other women, but it's the pendulum thing again. It's always been in the middle with her. A wonderful thing about sharing our lives with each other. We both have a similar set of beliefs, allowing me to be the whole person that I already am, not having to put on an act. I haven't felt the whole infatuation thing, just an even keel kind of thing. That's allowed me to feel great about making the commitment. The support from her, the beautiful thing about that, I don't need to change a single thing and still be loved as much as I was this morning. Hopefully that's the environment I create for her as well, accepted, respected, and loved by me. That's how it's come to be and how I've been able to recommit to that and feel great about it." A year later, Kurt confirmed that his marriage was going very well. He said, "I think it's the fact that both Jan and I are whole and complete where we are. So there isn't a huge over-reliance on the other individual. There isn't a huge dependence upon the other individual. It truly comes from a place of being totally happy for that individual, where they are, and more importantly, recognizing, okay, that being said, what's the best way I can support you in terms of you doing and being exactly what you want to be?" Having Jan as a good partner who accepted him as he was played an important role in Kurt's deepening of relationships with colleagues as he was continually promoted to positions of greater responsibility in his company. He described a shift in his thinking as moving away from managing others to leading collaboratively. So this relationship with his boss and his wife was prompting him to rethink how he related to other people. So let me change gears a little bit and talk about learning partnerships. Kurt's story conveys the complexity of the journey toward self-authorship. He was a dedicated and successful college student. He was highly involved. His parents encouraged him to listen to his own voice. And yet somehow he left college seeking affirmation and trying to follow society's plan. When it didn't work, he spent a lot of time and energy, experienced a lot of pain, struggling to get his internal voice to the foreground to coordinate his work, his self-worth, and his relationships. Having to face these dilemmas demanded that he construct an internal voice. I am left wondering whether more support in the form of better learning partners for Kurt during college could have helped him bring his internal voice out much earlier and saved him a lot of trouble and a lot of headaches as a young man. My participants' collective stories from their college and their post-college life have revealed a number of factors that seem to help young people develop more complex assumptions. And I've organized those factors into the learning partnerships model. And I offer that here as one way we might think about helping people stand apart from their assumptions and reframing them into something more complex. There are three components of this model that support learners' current assumptions. These involve respecting learners' thoughts and feelings, encouraging them to use their experiences as a starting point for learning as an opportunity for growth, and collaborating with them to analyze and solve their own dilemmas. Three components simultaneously challenge their existing assumptions. And these include emphasizing the complexity of work and life and discouraging simplistic solutions, drawing out learners' personal authority, and working interdependently to share authority and expertise to solve complex problems. In order to promote self-authorship, educators must engage learners in making sense of their experiences rather than them just having experiences. And more importantly, we must work interdependently with learners so that they make sense of their own experience rather than us making sense of it for them. I've likened the learning partnership model to a tandem bike, where the front rider directs the journey and the back rider provides fuel for the journey. Oftentimes, in my experience in education, educators take the front seat and put the learner on the back. I'm advocating that we should put the learners on the front and let them direct their own journey. And we could be on the back as good learning partners to help them reflect on, analyze, and make sense of their experiences in more complex ways. If we were to do that, we would find ourselves involved in what my colleague Patricia King and I have called reflective conversations that invite learners to reflect on and interpret the meaning of their experiences. I think Kurt would have benefited from learning partners during college. If somebody in his fraternity had helped him process, why are you typing a paper for someone else when you have your own work to do, and what do you think that means? If the advisors in the student organizations where he held leadership positions would have helped him sort through his tendency to self-sacrifice, he might have learned something about himself and his social relations from that. Although his parents tried to draw out his personal authority, it really took his dad's comment on moving to help Kurt realize that he needed to live a life of his own. So conversations about how to maintain family relationships as collegians transition out of college would have helped Kurt realize that living life on your own doesn't mean you have to sacrifice important relationships. Partners who could have helped Kurt process how to balance his needs in relation to other people's needs would have helped him construct his internal voice earlier. And although his experience as a legal assistant created the dissonance that prompted him to reevaluate that career path, he could have benefited from learning partners in that context to help him figure out what was it about that experience that conflicted with his values to help him clarify what those values really were. Kurt did finally find good partners, particularly in his work setting and eventually in his marriage, who helped him clarify what he believed, who he was, and how he wanted to relate to other people. Now, these learning partnerships are not limited to one-on-one conversations. Many of my colleagues have used these in lots of different settings with tremendous results. They've been used to construct many courses, including mathematics and science courses, writing curricula, general education curricula, leadership programs, cultural immersion programs, even orientation programs, and residential and student life curricula. All 6 of these components can be integrated into group settings about how an organization functions, how a residential group functions, how an academic course is conducted, how an orientation program is shaped. Even higher education policy could be shaped to share authority and expertise with learners. In my experience, that's not typically the case, but it could be. So with all that in mind, I'd like to ask you to think about how you might consider enhancing learning partnerships in the educational arena in which you work. And you may do much of this already, but here's some questions to think about. In terms of supporting learners' current assumptions, how can I genuinely consider learners' thoughts and feelings and convey that I value their perspectives, even if they're naive or incomplete? How can I ground learning in learners' experience so that they have a starting point for using their voices? How can I convey that we're mutual partners in the learning process? That's typically not the way education is framed, and I found myself even having a hard time with that transition. So that's a really important question. How can I convey that we're mutual partners? On the challenge side of things, to consider how to challenge and invite students to develop more complex assumptions, how can I draw learners' attention to the complexity of our learning and discourage simplistic solutions or answers, particularly if they've been accustomed to that and want that? How can I draw out learners' personal authority and encourage its development? How can I share authority and expertise with learners to create interdependent relationships in which they can participate mutually? The learning partnership model is more about a philosophy of learning and of the educator-learner relationship than it is about techniques. The 6 components, when integrated into a philosophy of learning, can really help learners reevaluate their relationships or their assumptions into more complex ones. Respecting learners' thoughts and feelings inherently entails respecting their current developmental assumptions, and that tailors the partnership to their current development. The mutual partnership enables shifting along with learners as they reframe their assumptions. Incorporating these dynamics into all educational experiences and offering a holistic educational experience, as Lifewide Education is advocating, helps adults integrate these assumptions about knowledge, self, and relationships. What I hope is evident here, however, is that learning and development require far more than having experiences. They require making meaning of experiences, something that's far more easily done in the company of good learning partners. Should you find these ideas interesting and want to pursue them further, I've provided a resource list that has various things that you could explore, and it also contains a few books. One of them, Making Their Own Way, explores my longitudinal participants' experience in their 20s, so a lot of struggle in the crossroads in there. Authoring Your Life traces their experience through their 30s, so nuances of self-authorship more so in that book. Developing and Assessing Self-Authorship addresses this concept across cultures and the degree to which it might or might not be relevant. The Learning Partnerships book has many examples of people actually using this in various settings and what the outcomes of those were. There are some of those stories in a Learning Communities journal that's on the resource list as well. The book Assessing Meaning Making and Self-Authorship offers an approach to assessing learners' development based on my longitudinal study and on a more recent longitudinal study called the Wabash National Study. And there are many other resources on that list as well. So I hope you found this intriguing. I hope you've picked up an idea or two that you might use to further your conversation. And I very much appreciate your listening to this, and I hope the rest of your conference goes well. Thanks very much.